The galaxy thought humans were soft, squishy diplomats trading grain for warp tech in climate-controlled halls. They forgot we evolved on a rock that actively tries to kill us. They forgot the most dangerous thing in the universe isn't a predator. It's a human watching a predator touch their kid. David Miller's head throbbed in time with the low, irritating hum of the station's atmospheric scrubbers. Sector 4 Customs was a masterclass in bureaucratic hostility. The walls were a seamless, blinding white polymer that smelled perpetually of industrial bleach and ozone. There were no chairs. The gravity was dialed up just enough to make human knees ache after 20 minutes. A subtle reminder from the Coalition that this space belonged to species with denser bones and better standing in the galactic hierarchy. David wiped a bead of sweat from his temple, his thumb pressing into his pulse point. He was a junior liaison. His job was to smile, stamp cargo manifests, and apologize when human freighters inevitably missed their docking windows. He hated it. He hated the sterile air. He hated the food, which tasted like textured cardboard. But mostly, he hated the constant, low-level humiliation. A few yards away, Toby was entirely oblivious to the geopolitical tensions of the room. Toby was 7. He was the son of Carter, a chief mechanic on a rust bucket hauler, currently dry-docked in Bay 12. Toby had scraped knees, a missing front tooth, and hands that were perpetually sticky, smelling faintly of synthetic grape juice and recycled grease. Right now, he was sitting on the polished floor, zooming a cheap plastic model of an old Earth shuttle around his feet. "Brrr!" Toby whispered, making explosion noises through his teeth. David watched him, a faint, tired smile touching his mouth. It was the only genuine expression he'd worn all week. Then, the doors to the inner concourse hissed open. The officer walked in. He was a Coalition enforcer, towering at 8 feet tall, entirely encased in a natural exoskeleton that looked like polished obsidian. He didn't walk so much as glide, his heavy, chitinous boots clicking rhythmically against the floor. He moved with the terrifying, unbothered arrogance of a creature that had never in its entire lifespan been told no. David felt his stomach tighten. It was a reflex. You didn't make eye contact with the enforcers. You shrank. You made yourself small. David dropped his gaze to his datapad, pretending to read a trade agreement about synthetic polymers. Toby didn't know the rules. Toby threw his plastic shuttle. It was supposed to do a loop. Instead, it skittered across the frictionless floor, bouncing with a hollow clack right off the toe of the officer's boot. The clicking footsteps stopped. The silence in the room was absolute. The background murmur of a dozen different alien languages died in human throats and alien mandibles alike. David looked up. His breath caught in his lungs. The officer looked down at the toy, then at the small, messy human boy sitting on the floor. "Sorry," Toby piped up, scrambling to his feet. He jogged over, holding his hand out for the toy. It slipped. The officer didn't speak. He didn't shift his weight. He simply lashed out. It wasn't a punch. It was a casual, dismissive backhand, the way a man might swat a biting fly. The armored ridge of the officer's forearm caught Toby flush across the side of his face. The sound was what David would hear in his nightmares for the rest of his life. It was a wet, heavy crack. Toby was lifted entirely off his feet. He spun in the air, a rag doll in a faded blue t-shirt, and hit the pristine white polymer floor head first. He skidded a few feet, his small shoes squeaking against the polished surface, and then came to a dead stop. He didn't cry. He didn't move. A stark, brilliant splash of crimson blood began to pool rapidly beneath his cheek, staining the sterile white floor. The officer stepped over the plastic toy, his boots crunching the cheap plastic into splinters, and continued walking toward the checkpoint. He didn't even look back. To him, it was property damage. An annoyance, nothing more. David's hands began to shake, not with a surge of heroic fury, but with cold, sickening terror. His heart hammered violently against his ribs, making him lightheaded. The rational part of his brain, the diplomat, the coward, the survivor, screamed at him to stay still. It's an enforcer. It's Coalition space. You touch him, you die. The whole station gets purged. He stood frozen for 3 agonizing seconds. He felt the bile rise in his throat, tasting like stale coffee and acid. He looked at the aliens around him, tall, elegant beings with luminous skin. Squat, reptilian merchants, all of them were looking away. None of them cared. It was just a human. Then Toby twitched. A small, awful, gurgling sound escaped the boy's lips. Something in David's chest simply broke. It wasn't a clean snap. It was a messy, jagged rupture of every diplomatic protocol drilled into his head. The fear didn't leave him. It just calcified into something dense and cold. He dropped his datapad. The screen shattered against the floor. David crossed the room. His legs felt numb, as if he were walking underwater. He dropped to his knees, ignoring the wet, sticky warmth that soaked into his slacks. "Toby!" David whispered. His voice was hoarse. "Hey, buddy, don't move!" The boy's face was a ruin. The left side was already swelling. The skin split wide open over the cheekbone, revealing the white flash of bone beneath. His breathing was ragged, wet bubbles forming at the corner of his mouth. David pulled off his suit jacket, rolling it up with clumsy, trembling hands, and pressed it gently against the boy's head to stop the bleeding. The smell of copper was overwhelming, cutting through the sterile ozone of the room. It smelled like earth. It smelled like life spilling out where it didn't belong. A shadow fell over them. The officer had stopped at the clearance gate, annoyed by the delay as the automated scanners processed his credentials. He looked back at David kneeling in the blood. When he spoke, the translation matrix implanted behind David's ear turned the alien's clicking syllables into flat, perfect English. If your livestock cannot control its offspring, it should not bring them out of the holding pens. Clean the floor. David didn't look at him. He couldn't. If he looked at the officer, he would vomit, or he would run at him and be torn in half. He just kept his hands pressed against Toby's head. "I need a medic!" David yelled, finally finding his voice. It cracked, sounding pathetic even to his own ears. "Somebody get a damn medic!" A human woman, a low-level clerk from the agricultural exchange, broke ranks from the terrified crowd and rushed over. She was sobbing quietly. Her hands stained as she helped David hold the jacket against the boy. "I got him," she whispered frantically. "I got him, David. Go." David stood up. He was dizzy. His hands were slick with red. He looked at the officer, who was now walking through the cleared gate, heading toward the inner transit corridors. David reached into his pocket and pulled out his comms unit. He bypassed the diplomatic channels. He bypassed the station's security. He dialed a direct frequency down to the engineering bowels of the station, where the coalition let the humans do the dirty, heavy lifting in the zero-gravity dry docks. The line clicked open. The sound of heavy machinery and grinding metal flooded David's ear. "Yeah?" a gruff voice answered. It was Cole, foreman of the rigging crew. David's throat was tight. He couldn't form a complete, articulate sentence. The polished diplomat was gone. "Bay 12, David breathed, staring at the smear of Toby's blood on his own palm. "Carter's kid. An enforcer just broke his skull on level 4. He's bleeding out." There was no gasp on the other end of the line. There was no barrage of questions. There was only a beat of absolute, terrifying silence. Then, the background noise of the heavy machinery abruptly whined to a halt. "Which way did it go?" Cole asked. His voice was completely devoid of emotion. "Transit Corridor B," David said, heading toward the council spire. "Keep the kid breathing, Miller," Cole said. The line went dead. David stood in the middle of the concourse. He felt entirely detached from his own body. He watched the medical drones finally arrive, their anti-grav engines humming as they hovered over Toby, injecting coagulants and pain blockers. He didn't stay with the boy. He couldn't. He turned and walked toward Transit Corridor B. He wasn't running. He was following the trail. 3 minutes later, the elevator doors at the end of the concourse hissed open, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. 4 men walked out. They didn't wear tailored suits or coalition uniforms. They wore heavy, industrial canvas, stained with engine oil, plasma burns, and old sweat. Cole was in the lead, a man built like a concrete pillar, his face scarred from a micrometeoroid strike years ago. Behind him were Wyatt, Sullivan, and Briggs. They carried the scent of grease, stale tobacco, and unwashed exhaustion. They didn't look at the crowd. They didn't look at the medical drones. They walked with a heavy, synchronized purpose, their steel-toed boots hitting the deck plates like the steady, inevitable pounding of a war drum. Cole held a heavy-duty plasma cutter in his right hand. The safety guard was removed. Wyatt had a 2-foot length of solid tungsten piping, stripped from a thermal exhaust manifold. They stopped next to David. Cole looked at the pool of blood on the floor. He didn't flinch. His jaw just tightened, a muscle feathering under the heavy scar tissue of his cheek. "Is he alive?" Cole asked, his eyes tracking the red droplets leading toward the transit corridor. "Barely," David whispered. His hands were still shaking. He held them out, showing Cole the blood. He didn't even look back, Cole. He just swatted him. Wyatt spat on the pristine white polymer floor. "All right." No battle cries, no speeches about human dignity. They were laborers. When a machine broke, you dismantled it. When a predator entered the camp, you put it down. David fell in step beside them. He didn't have a weapon. He didn't know how to fight. But the invisible tether of the pack had pulled tight. He couldn't stay behind. Transit Corridor B was a vast, echoing tunnel of brushed steel and flickering blue lumen strips designed to shuttle diplomats and officials toward the High Council spire. There were no cameras here, a concession to the secretive backroom dealings of the coalition politicians. The officer was halfway down the corridor, his pace unhurried. He was a creature of absolute apex supremacy. Nothing hunted an enforcer. Until today. The sound of the heavy work boots echoing down the tunnel finally made him stop. The officer turned, his mandibles twitching in annoyance. He saw the 5 humans. He saw the weapons. He didn't look afraid. He looked insulted. "You violate quarantine zones," the officer's translation matrix barked, the artificial voice carrying a metallic rasp. "Return to your pens or be purged." "Purge this," Wyatt snarled. Wyatt threw the first strike. He didn't use a martial stance. He just swung the tungsten pipe like a baseball bat, aiming straight for the officer's knee joint. The officer was fast, terrifyingly fast. He sidestepped the swing with fluid grace and backhanded Wyatt exactly as he had struck the boy. Wyatt took the blow to the chest, the heavy chitin armor cracking 2 of his ribs with a sickening pop. Wyatt slammed into the wall, coughing blood, but he didn't go down. He just laughed a wet, crazy sound that made David's skin crawl. Because Wyatt was a distraction. While the officer was focused on Wyatt, Sullivan hit him from the right. Sullivan was a heavy G lifter. He tackled the officer around the waist. The sheer dense momentum of 250 pounds of human muscle crashing into the alien didn't knock the enforcer over, but it threw him off balance. The officer hissed, reaching down to grab Sullivan by the neck. Then Cole swung the plasma cutter. He didn't ignite the blade. He used the heavy, battery-weighted handle as a bludgeon, slamming it directly into the officer's elbow. There was no graceful choreography. It was a messy, brutal brawl. It was a bar fight in the dark, stripped of all dignity. The officer screamed a high, screeching sound of tearing metal and insectoid fury. The chitin on his arm splintered, oozing a foul, ammonia-scented blue fluid. The smell hit David like a physical blow. It smelled like window cleaner and rotting fish. He gagged, stumbling backward against the corridor wall, watching the horror unfold. He wanted to look away. He forced his eyes to stay open. The officer shoved Sullivan off, drawing a sleek, silver sidearm from his hip. Briggs didn't hesitate. He grabbed the officer's wrist with both hands, planting his boots on the wall, and used his entire body weight to drag the alien's arm down. The gun fired into the floor, melting a smoking crater into the steel. Wyatt recovered, stepping in close. He raised the tungsten pipe and brought it down on the officer's hand. Crack! The gun clattered to the floor. The alien shrieked again, thrashing wildly. Its raw strength was immense. It threw Briggs halfway across the corridor. But the humans didn't retreat. They swarmed. They were persistent, exhaustingly relentless, driven by an ancient mammalian reflex that cared nothing for galactic law. Cole grabbed the officer by the sensory crest on the back of his neck, forcing the towering alien down to his knees. The enforcer struggled, his armor scraping against the steel floor, throwing sparks. "Hold him!" Cole roared, his face sprayed with the alien's blue blood. Sullivan and Wyatt pinned the alien's arms, driving their knees into the joints, ignoring the sharp edges of the chitin that sliced into their canvas pants and their skin. David stood paralyzed. His chest heaved. The reality of what was happening was crushing him. They were murdering a coalition official. They were all going to hang. Earth would be embargoed. But as he looked at the thrashing alien, he didn't see an official. He saw the wet, heavy crack of Toby's skull hitting the floor. "Do it," David whispered. Then, louder, his voice cracking with a feral, ugly rage. "Do it, Cole." Cole didn't hesitate. He thumbed the ignition switch on the plasma cutter. A jet of blue-white fire roared to life, humming with a sound that vibrated in David's teeth. The heat radiating from it instantly caused the sweat on David's face to evaporate. The officer finally stopped struggling. The apex predator suddenly realized it was prey. It looked up at Cole, its compound eyes wide. You cannot." The translation matrix stuttered. "Watch me," Cole grunted. He drove the plasma blade into the gap between the officer's neck and shoulder plating. The corridor filled with the shrieking sound of boiling fluid and burning tissue. Thick, acrid yellow smoke billowed into the air, suffocating and hot. David coughed, his eyes watering, but he couldn't look away. The officer thrashed violently, a primal death throw, but the heavy lifters held him down with the unyielding pressure of gravity itself. It took 10 agonizing, drawn-out seconds. It wasn't a clean slice. The plasma cutter was meant for starship hulls, not biological matter. Cole had to saw through thick bundles of cartilage and heavy bone analogs. With a final, sickening crunch, the resistance gave way. The massive body of the enforcer slumped to the floor, twitching as its nervous system misfired. Silence slammed back into the corridor, broken only by the heavy, ragged breathing of the four men. Wyatt leaned against the wall, clutching his broken ribs, spitting a glob of blood onto the floor. Sullivan wiped the stinging blue fluid from his eyes, his breathing heavy. Cole shut off the plasma cutter. The hum died. The head lay on the floor. It was the size of a microwave oven, heavy and grotesque, the mandibles still twitching slightly in post-mortem spasms. The severed neck stump hissed, cauterized flesh, mixing with the ammonia smell. Cole looked at David. He didn't say a word. He just nudged the heavy head with his boot. David stared at it. His diplomatic career was dead. His life, as he knew it, was over. But as he looked at the dead eyes of the creature that had casually broken a child's skull, he felt a cold, terrifying calm wash over him. The panic was gone. The coward was dead. David walked forward. His dress shoes slipped slightly in the pool of blue fluid. He bent down. He reached out with both hands and grabbed the heavy sensory crests protruding from the skull. It was shockingly heavy, dragging his shoulders down, the scorched flesh burning the palms of his hands. He ignored the pain. He lifted it. The weight of it against his leg was real and undeniable. "Where to, Miller?" Cole asked quietly, wiping his bloody hands on his pants. David looked down the long, echoing corridor. At the end of it lay the golden doors of the High Council chambers, where the architects of the galaxy sat in their pristine, untouched superiority. "We have a meeting," David said. His voice was completely dead. He started walking. The blue fluid dripped from the severed neck, leaving a steady, dark trail on the spotless steel floor behind him. The heavy lifters fell in step behind him, their boots pounding out the rhythm of the end of an era. They were going to drop the galaxy's arrogance right onto its polished marble floors. The elevator that led to the High Council spire was a cylinder of transparent aluminum, designed to give visiting dignitaries a sweeping, godlike view of the station and the star-flecked void beyond. Usually it played a soft harmonic chime meant to soothe the nervous systems of lesser species before they faced the Coalition's elite. Today, the chime was broken. shorted out by the sheer volume of viscous blue fluid that had dripped from the enforcer's severed neck and seeped into the floor grates. David leaned his shoulder against the cool glass. His arms were shaking violently, a deep, bone-deep tremor that he couldn't suppress. The adrenaline that had propelled him to pick up the head was bleeding out, leaving behind a cold, nauseating exhaustion. His hands were locked in a death grip around the thick, ridged, sensory crests of the alien skull. The flesh was still warm. It felt like holding a heavily armored dead dog. The smell was trapped in the small space with them, a suffocating blend of scorched chitin, spilled ammonia, and the sharp, coppery tang of Wyatt's human blood. He looked at the reflection in the glass. He didn't recognize himself. His crisp, gray diplomatic shirt was torn at the collar and soaked in an abstract mural of red and blue. His tie was gone. His face was pale, smeared with grease from where he had wiped his sweating forehead. Behind him, the heavy lifters stood in absolute silence. Wyatt was slumped in the corner, his left arm wrapped tightly around his cracked ribs, his breath whistling through his teeth with every inhalation. Sullivan was staring blankly at the floor, his massive knuckles split and bleeding. Briggs was rewrapping a plasma burn on his forearm with a dirty rag torn from his shirt. Cole simply stood in the center, his boots planted wide, the heavy plasma cutter hanging loosely at his side. He looked like a man waiting for a bus. The silence wasn't comfortable. It was the silence of men who had just stepped off a cliff and were waiting to hit the ground. "My hands are going numb," David said. His voice was a thin, raspy croak. It sounded terribly loud in the small glass tube. Cole looked over. He didn't offer to take the head. He understood, in some primal, unspoken way, that David had to be the one to carry it. "Squeeze your thumbs," Cole grunted. "Keeps the blood flowing in the forearms. Don't drop it now, Miller. It'd be a real mess to pick back up." David swallowed hard. He dug his thumbs into the hard ridges of the skull. The pain sharpened his focus. The elevator decelerated, gravity pushing heavily against their knees, and came to a smooth halt. The doors hissed open. They stepped out into the promenade of the ancients. It was a breathtaking architectural marvel, a long, wide corridor vaulted with arches of spun gold and white marble. Hydroponic streams of crystal-clear water ran down the center, flanked by luminescent alien flora that smelled faintly of crushed vanilla and rain. It was a space designed to intimidate through sheer, overwhelming elegance. David's dress shoes left wet, dark blue footprints on the pristine white stone. The promenade was bustling with the upper crust of the galaxy. Tall, slender avian diplomats draped in shimmering silks, heavily jeweled merchant lords carried on anti-grav palanquins, aides and secretaries murmuring into datapads. The chatter died the instant David stepped out of the elevator. It was a physical wave of silence, rippling down the length of the hall. The elegant aliens stopped in their tracks. The merchant lords peered over the edges of their palanquins. Their compound eyes, secondary pupils, and thermal sensors all locked onto the small, bloody human holding the severed head of a coalition enforcer. Panic is a universal language. A sleek, amphibious diplomat dropped his datapad. It shattered on the marble. An avian aide shrieked a high, piercing sound and scrambled backward, tearing her silk robes in her haste to get away. The crowd parted, pressing themselves flat against the vaulted walls, abandoning the center of the promenade. They weren't just looking at the head. They were looking at the humans. They were looking at Wyatt spitting a glob of bloody phlegm into the hydroponic stream. They were looking at Cole's scarred, dead-eyed stare. For 2 centuries, humanity had been categorized as a Class 3 subspecies, useful for heavy labor, adaptable to varied atmospheres, and easily cowed by shows of technological superiority. They were soft. They negotiated. They apologized. David walked down the center of the promenade, the heavy head bumping against his thigh with a wet thwack every 2 steps. He felt a hysterical laugh bubbling up in the back of his throat, tasting like bile. He swallowed it down. His lungs burned. Every step felt like walking through deep mud. "I am a dead man," he thought. "We are all dead men. They'll glass the earth for this." But the image of Toby, the small, faded blue t-shirt, the wet crunch of his skull, the absolute disregard in the enforcer's posture, flashed behind David's eyes. The fear remained, cold and sharp in his gut, but it was overshadowed by a crushing, suffocating anger. It wasn't the fiery wrath of a hero. It was the ugly, stubborn refusal of an animal backed into a corner. At the end of the promenade stood the doors to the High Council chamber. They were massive slabs of dark, polished wood, inlaid with the silver crest of the coalition. Standing before them were two royal guards. They were not standard station security. They were of the same species as the enforcer, but vastly larger, bred specifically for violence. Their chiton was plated in ceremonial gold armor, and they held long, humming thermal pikes that could slice a transport shuttle in half. The guards saw the humans approaching. They saw the head. They crossed their pikes, blocking the doors. The hum of the weapons escalated to a threatening shriek, the air around the blades rippling with heat distortion. "Halt!" the left guard bellowed. The translation matrix vibrated against David's skull. "You are in violation of..." David didn't stop. He didn't even slow down. He just kept walking, his eyes fixed on the silver crest between the doors. The guard stepped forward, raising the thermal pike, aiming the searing blade directly at David's chest. "Step back. Livestock, or be incinerated." David's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. His legs wanted to buckle. He forced them to move. One step. Two. He was 10 feet away. The heat from the pike was drying the sweat on his face. Cole stepped up, inserting his massive frame between David and the blade. Cole didn't raise his plasma cutter. He didn't take a fighting stance. He just looked up at the towering 8-foot-tall guard, his scarred face a mask of absolute terrifying boredom. "Move," Cole said. It wasn't a shout. It was a low, gravelly statement of fact. The guard hesitated. It was a fraction of a second, a microscopic glitch in the alien's combat conditioning. But it was there, because a prey animal doesn't march into the den of a predator carrying the severed head of its kin. A prey animal runs. These creatures weren't running, they were marching. In that millisecond of hesitation, Sullivan moved. The heavy G-lifter didn't strike the guard. He simply threw his entire body weight against the massive dark wood door on the right. The latch, designed for diplomatic entry, not forced entry by a quarter-ton of dense muscle, gave way with a resounding, explosive crack. The door swung inward, banging violently against the marble wall of the chamber inside. The guards flinched at the sound. Cole shoved the crossed pikes aside with his thick forearm, ignoring the blistering heat that singed the hair off his skin. He grabbed David by the shoulder and pushed him roughly through the threshold. "Go," Cole growled. David stumbled through the doorway, his dress shoes slipping on the smooth floor. He caught his balance, gripping the bloody head tight against his chest, and looked up. He had entered the inner sanctum. The High Council chamber was vast, circular, and bathed in a cool, artificial twilight. The floor was a single, flawless piece of black obsidian, polished to a mirror finish. In the center was a sunken, circular pit where petitioners stood. Surrounding the pit, rising in steep, tiered rows, were the seats of the council. Dozens of the most powerful beings in the galaxy sat in the shadows. They were ancient, elegant, and utterly detached from the physical realities of the universe they governed. A high arbiter, a creature composed mostly of bioluminescent tentacles and flowing white robes, was hovering at a podium, droning on about orbital shipping tariffs in a voice like chimes. The explosive crack of the door hitting the wall cut the arbiter off mid-sentence. The silence that rushed into the chamber was absolute. It was thick, heavy, and pregnant with the shock of a space that had not been violated in 10,000 years. David stood at the edge of the sunken pit. He was gasping for air, his chest heaving, the sharp pain in his hands burning all the way up to his shoulders. He felt the eyes of the council boring into him. He felt their disdain, their confusion, their mounting outrage. Behind him, Wyatt, Sullivan, and Briggs stepped into the room, their boots scuffing the perfect obsidian floor. Cole stood in the doorway, blocking the guards, his back to the room. The High Arbiter's tentacles flushed an angry, violent crimson. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" the Arbiter demanded. The voice boomed through the chamber's acoustic dampeners, shaking the floor beneath David's feet. "You are a Class 3 liaison. You have desecrated the inner sanctum. The penalty is immediate." David didn't wait for the translation to finish. He stepped forward to the very edge of the petitioner's pit. He took a deep breath, his lungs expanding against his torn shirt, and he let go. He didn't throw it. He just opened his cramped, aching hands. The heavy, armored skull of the enforcer dropped. It hit the polished obsidian floor with a wet, meaty, hollow thud that echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. It bounced once, leaving a thick, smearing trail of blue blood, and rolled to a stop precisely at the base of the High Arbiter's podium. The dead, compound eyes stared up at the ceiling. The severed mandibles twitched one final time, scraping against the stone. Someone in the upper tiers gasped. A few council members stood up, knocking over their digital slates. The High Arbiter recoiled, hovering backward, its robes pulling away from the bleeding head as if it were radioactive. "He hit a kid," David said. His voice didn't boom. It didn't echo. It cracked. It sounded exhausted, small, and terribly, terribly human. He swallowed hard, tasting blood and copper in the back of his throat, and forced himself to speak louder. Level 4 Customs. 30 minutes ago, a 7-year-old boy dropped a plastic toy on his boot. Your enforcer broke the boy's skull open. The High Arbiter stared at the head, then looked at David, its bioluminescence flashing rapidly between crimson and a terrified pale white. This is an enforcer of the Vanguard. You have murdered an agent of the state over a piece of livestock. David felt a cold mechanical click in his brain. The diplomat died entirely. The man remained. "You think we're livestock?" David said, stepping down into the pit. His shoes squelched in the blue fluid. He walked right up to the head, standing directly beneath the towering Arbiter. "You think because we smile, because we sign your trade agreements, because we take your insults and live in your gravity and eat your synthetic trash, that we are soft." He pointed a shaking, blood-stained finger down at the dead enforcer. "This thing thought we were soft. It thought it could swat a human child and walk away." David looked up, scanning the tiered rows of the silent, horrified aliens. "You forgot where we come from." David dragged a hand across his face, wiping sweat and blood into a muddy smear across his cheek. He was trembling, but he didn't lower his voice. "We didn't evolve in climate-controlled spires. We didn't inherit the stars from benevolent ancestors. We come from a rock where the gravity crushes you, the weather drowns you, and half the biosphere evolved specifically to inject venom into your veins." He stepped closer to the podium. The Arbiter flinched back. "We survived because we made a deal with each other a long, long time ago," David whispered, his voice vibrating with a dark, ugly intensity. "We protect our own. You can tax our grain. You can gouge us on warp drives. You can make us stand in your hallways for hours." David kicked the heavy skull with the toe of his ruined dress shoe. It spun heavily, facing the council. "But you do not touch our children. You do not touch our pack." The chamber was dead silent. The faint hum of the climate control was the only sound. "I know the law," David said, his voice finally steadying, turning flat and hollow. "I know what this means. You'll embargo Earth. You'll send the fleet. But I want you to look at that head, Arbiter. Look at it." The alien reluctantly looked down. "It took 4 mechanics with basic tools 3 minutes to butcher your apex predator in a transit corridor," David said. "If you send the fleet, if you threaten our world, you won't be fighting diplomats. You'll be fighting 12 billion animals who will burn the galaxy to ash to keep their young safe." David stood there for a long moment. He felt empty. The adrenaline was entirely gone, replaced by a crushing physical weight that made him want to lie down on the cold floor and sleep for a year. He didn't wait for a response. There was nothing left to say. The message wasn't in his words. The message was bleeding out onto their perfect floor. He turned his back on the High Council. He walked out of the pit, his steps heavy and dragging. Wyatt pushed himself off the wall, limping heavily. Sullivan and Briggs fell in line. Cole stepped back through the doorway, his eyes sweeping the room one last time before he turned away. They walked past the royal guards, who still stood with their pikes lowered, paralyzed by a paradigm shift they couldn't comprehend. The heavy wooden doors swung shut behind them, sealing the silence inside the chamber. Out in the hallway, the cool air of the promenade hit David like a physical blow. His knees finally buckled. He didn't fall entirely, but he stumbled, catching himself hard against the marble wall. He slid down, his back against the cool stone, until he was sitting on the floor. He pulled his knees to his chest and buried his face in his bloody, trembling hands. He couldn't breathe right. He was hyperventilating, the sheer terror of what he had just done finally catching up to his nervous system. A heavy hand dropped onto his shoulder. It was Cole. The massive mechanic knelt beside him. He didn't offer empty comforts. He didn't tell him everything was going to be all right, because it probably wasn't. They were in uncharted territory now. The whole human race was. Cole just squeezed David's shoulder, a tight, grounding pressure. Carter called the comms on the way up. Cole rumbled quietly. The smell of grease and ozone on his jacket somehow cut through the blood. Kid's stable. The medics got the swelling down. He's going to make it. David squeezed his eyes shut. A single hot tear cut through the grime on his face, stinging as it mixed with the blue alien blood on his cheek. He let out a long, shuddering breath, his shoulders dropping. "Okay," David whispered to the empty, terrified hallway. "Okay." He looked at his hands. They were ruined, but as he pressed them against his knees and forced himself to stand back up, he knew he would never try to wash the stain away. The galaxy had thought they were soft. They would never make that mistake again. That's the reality of the Deathworlders. We don't ask for the universe, but we will break anyone who touches our own. If this raw, unapologetic slice of humanity got your blood pumping, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep space grit. What would you have done in David's place? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Share this video with someone who knows that humanity's greatest weapon isn't our tech, it's our pack. Stay safe and stay human.